Yesher Koach. There's a lot to talk about today, but I want to begin with something really important and fundamental to what you see on Shabbat and what happens here and what doesn't happen here. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote a book very recently that you may want to check out. Go to Amazon, see what he's up to. And when talking about synagogues, particularly in the United States, who have clearly identified themselves as Democrat or Republican, and where rabbis preach from the bima for one choice or another, Rabbi Sacks says it's a grave mistake, and it's not a small thing, it's a big thing, because it fundamentally is divisive within the principled walls of a synagogue. Now, I know, and I have many colleagues who I respect tremendously who have made this choice. And it's a choice that perhaps feels like it has to be made one way or the other, and everybody has an opinion, and people leave shuls now all the time because of the political opinion expressed in the pulpit, or the politics of the shul, or the choices that synagogues make to participate in one political view or another. But for those of you who've been watching and those of you who know me, I think that it's more important for me to teach Judaism and values and identity than to talk about current events entirely. I also think that the political is best addressed with an internal conversation about values as opposed to an external conversation about politics. I think that engaging in the politic is engaging too far in the moment, and moments from now, something else will happen and change will happen, and we've spent our little currency in which we could have taught long-lasting and forever archetypal values on the temporal and the momentary and the frivolous, and while it may seem deeply important in the moment, Judaism has always sought to look for the big picture which informs the local, as opposed to the local informing the big picture. That's why when I teach and when we learn, it's big ideas. Some of them are anachronistic, some are archaic, some are archival, some are asymmetrical, some are contradictory. That in itself is a form of politic, but that politic was designed to span thousands of years and not in the moment. And there's lots to say about what's happening now, and believe me, I have opinions, but that's not the time that's not what I want to spend in the time that we have on the moment. You can read it, you can make your own decisions, but when it comes to rabbis on the pulpit taking a stand one way or the other, Rabbi Sacks says that when you mix religion and politics, you get terrible politics, and even worse, religion. And it's a hard thing to say because fundamentally religion is political. On the other hand, today's politics, by adding religion into them, is only incendiary and not helpful. And I respect the fact that individuals have to make decisions, and I respect the fact that clergy assist in those decisions, but I do not wish to assist you in making those decisions because we've talked about which party or which lies or which truths or which behaviors or which attitudes. I'd rather do that from the framework which makes us Jewish, which is this body of knowledge that we can turn to for how to be a good person. And that is the source from which you can begin making decisions. There are many sources. This is one of them. This is the one I choose to share with you. And believe me, those of you who know that I have quite an extensive knowledge of politics. But the pulpit and Shabbat, for me, is about Judaism's view of the world, which informs politics, not politics, which informs Judaism's view of the world. Having said that, we're all a little bit worried because it seems like we're taking it easy. Things are settling in. People are maybe loosening up a bit, getting used to it. I don't have it. I got tested. I'm fine. We're all good. Getting a little closer. Well, I don't know. The numbers might creep up. They might stay where they are. Winter's coming, maybe flu season. But certainly, going back to school is going to change everything, as I've said. And obviously, the schism between young and old is going to get larger, not smaller. And we have to hope for the best. So let's be hopeful and hang in there, little bits at a time. In this week's portion, we have so many incredible ideas, and I'm going to teach you a few of them. I could probably say 10, might even be more. First of all, something incredibly astonishing happens. Moses has, let's say, a week's worth of lectures to give to the Jewish people. And in those, let's say it's a few hours a day. Let's say he gives one lecture a day for 2-3 hours. He's got 2 or 3 hours, maybe 5 days, so let's say 15 hours, to teach everything he knows about Jewish life to a new generation, most of whom have lost their parents. They were the ones that left Egypt. This new generation only knows life in the desert as a nomad. So the first thing he wants to teach them is that the Edomite, remember the Edomite, Esau, the brother of Jacob. Ishmael was the brother of Isaac. Esau, the brother of Jacob, the one that Jacob stole the blessing from, the one that Esau threatened to kill Jacob but never did. Remember that guy? He's known as Esav HaRasha, the wicked, although it's hard to find his wickedness in the Torah. Well, Moses tells us, Lo tatayev Edomi, do not despise the Edomite because he's your brother. The Edomite, not Esau, the Edomite, that entire nation that is at constant conflict with the Jewish people, do not despise them because they are your brother. That needs a lot of thinking. What does he mean? Why does Moses say, don't despise him? Maybe Moses is saying, don't hang out with him, you don't have to live with him, you don't have to love him, but don't despise him. Now look at what Moses does next. This is, to me, earth-shattering, and it may reveal more about Moses than it does about Jewish life, but it also may reveal a lot about Jewish identity. Do not despise the Egyptian. This is chapter 23, verse 8. Do not despise the Egyptian, since you were an immigrant in their land. Therefore, children born to these nations in the 3rd generation after becoming proselytes may enter God's marriage group. Okay, so if you want to marry an Egyptian, of the ancient Egyptians we're talking, after 3 generations, they're more than welcome. You need a gap of 3 generations to separate yourselves from the animosity and the hate and the narratives and the propaganda. But once there's a genuine commitment in 3 generations, then it's sanitized. But Moses says, do not hate the Egyptian because you were an immigrant and they hosted you in their land. Is Moses ignoring the fact that they enslaved them? How does Moses say that the Egyptians are acceptable? Is Moses trying to defend his own roots where he was raised as an Egyptian? Or is Moses genuinely trying to say that even though the plan went awry, they welcomed you with open arms initially, and that cannot be forgotten? Or is Moses saying that you had to go through slavery to become who you are, and while it was horrible, and while it was earth-shatteringly horrible, at the end of the day, they were your host? I don't know. It doesn't say. It gives us no more information here, but it does tell us something, and that is the hatred of Egyptians, of the ancient Egyptian society, because of slavery, came to an end after 3 generations. It was over. That is an extraordinary statement by Moses. It's an extraordinary idea, and it does need some unpacking. Now, from the sublime to the banal of the highest order, listen to this. The Torah, you say to someone, What's the holiest book? The Bible, the Torah, the Quran, whatever religion they're in. It's the holiest book. What does your holy book contain? Oh, these lofty ideals, these great stories of great people, relationships with God. No, our book has stuff in it that's kind of weird, like this. Like when you go out to war and you have a camp, you have to dig yourself a bathroom outside the camp, not in the camp. And bring a shovel. None of this on the ground stuff. Why? V'haya machanecha kadosh, so that your campsite be sanctified, be sacred. Don't demean yourselves by having sewage near you. Now, I mean, this sounds like a simple manual, right? We all know about open sewers in major cities and diseases and horrible things that come out of that. We know that that is a sign of societal devaluation, where the poor are often given the worst areas to live in. We know that the Romans spent extraordinary amount of effort to try to sanitize their camp, so to speak. Here, the text of the Torah takes time out of its very short agenda, with very limited time, to talk about bathrooms at campsites. Because, obviously, human beings should not take themselves lightly. Wherever they are can be sacred. Don't demean it. Just because you're outdoors, just because it's in nature, just because it might go and get absorbed back into the earth, stuff that is of general disdain should be hidden and put away so you retain your humanity no matter where you are, no matter who you're with. I always found it fascinating that Moses takes time out of his very short life that he has left to talk about things that seem incredibly banal, but teach people an extraordinary lesson. It is inappropriate to do something that is vulgar or disgusting to another human being. There are places in the world where spitting in public will get you a huge fine or put you in jail. The idea that doing things in public that are inappropriate embarrass or shame or disgust or discomfort people around you. One person cannot hold the entire agenda by their behavior. And that is why there are laws against public indecency. You can't just do whatever you want, wherever you want, just because you're, as I said, just because you're on the ship does not mean you can drill a hole under your seat and let water in. Just because you paid for your ticket on the ship does not mean you own your piece of the ship. It belongs to everybody, and you're a passenger, not an owner. And when you're part of society, you don't own your rights within society at the exclusion of everybody else. You have to conform. Sorry, you have to conform. This is obviously going to lead to a conversation about masks and other behaviors. It's a complicated story, but fundamentally, Moses is laying down, once you get beyond the digging the hole and whatever, you start to realize Moses is laying down a very, very critical law, which is do what you have to do in a way that doesn't make other people uncomfortable, grossed out, or feel indecent. These are the structures of society. Okay, a most extraordinarily relevant and perhaps shocking piece of text for you. Verse 16 in chapter 23. So there you are working on your farm. You're having a bumper year. You've got Concord grapes. You're making Manischewitz wine. It's beautiful. These grapes are delicious, better than ever. And up the dusty road, you see what looks like a slave. He's got slave clothing on, maybe even has some of his leg iron still stuck to him, and he's limping up your road, and you see him from a distance, and you tell the dogs to sit. You get on your horse, and you start riding down the road, and you see it's an escaped slave. And you say to him, "What's your name?" And he says, whatever, Django. And you say, where are you from? He says, well, I was slave to Mr. Smith over the ridge over there, across the river, the third farm. And you say, and what are you doing here? He says, I escaped. Are you going back? No. What does the Torah say? Okay, let's see. If a slave seeks refuge with you from his master, you must not turn him back over to his master. He must be, ready? He must be allowed to live alongside you wherever he chooses in your settlements. Wherever he chooses in your settlements. You must do nothing to hurt his feelings. An escaped slave cannot be sent back to his master. Why? Why is this so important to Moses? Well, Moses, as you know, dealt with slaves and escaping and others who turned on him in their slavery. Moses understood that part of slavery is either the cruelty of a master who holds a slave chained beyond their will, or a slave who is consented for some reason to remain enslaved. Fear, anxiety, loss of their children. And if you start reading things like the Book of Negroes, or you start reading stories, The End of the World, you start to understand what slavery really was all about. It wasn't just one individual indentured to another individual. It was one individual, perhaps, with a family who, while they could escape, they'd have to leave their children or wife, who might not be working on the same plantation. They might be working miles away. So the cost of escaping was often the cost of everything that you held dear. And the Torah, 2,700 years ago, does not say, call the master, return it. No, not only does he not have to be returned, he's a free person. If you escape, you're free, which is because what they aspired to do was make slavery voluntary, in the sense that you've chosen to serve, but you are not owned by anybody. If you choose to leave, you're free. That was Moses' highest ideal, is that although slavery existed, it could not be by force. It's a bit of a twist on slavery, but self-enslavement is another form in which someone says, I am going to get a job and get work. In essence, all employment is a form of self-accepted enslavement. Rules, obligations, hours, commitments, risk of firing, censure. But employers cannot treat their employees without respect. And if an employee wants to leave, you can't keep them. And if a slave wants to leave, you shouldn't be able to keep them. And if a slave left, they can go wherever they want. And you're not even allowed to hurt his feelings. They can live wherever they want. There's no such thing as a part of our city that is only for good Jews or original Jews, wherever. This is an extraordinary moment in Jewish history. How do we treat a slave? The answer is, we treat a slave with the supposition that if they can't leave, they're a slave. And if they can leave, they have a choice. And if they can leave and have a choice and be free, and they wish to, they are. And if they don't want to leave, that's their choice. Of course, the Torah has many other laws about how the master has to treat the slave, and basically it levels out the whole notion of master and slave because the slave needs to be treated extraordinarily well. I don't want to get into the whole lengthy conversation about a slave who is freed by their master automatically becomes 50% Jewish, and then if they convert finally, they become fully Jewish. So having a slave was a stepping stone to full acceptance. But that's a whole other conversation. But think about the time frame in which Moses is proposing the idea that slavery fundamentally has to be abolished, and only self-chosen indenturedness is acceptable, and the moment you choose no longer to be a slave or no longer to be employed, you have to leave. Just imagine if you quit your job and your boss says, if you quit your job, you're never going to see your kids again. It's not how it works. That's what Moses is proposing. Freedom and choice, even for slaves. When it comes to the laws of prostitution, there's a lot to talk about, but what I want to fundamentally focus on is the term that is used for a prostitute. The Torah does not use the word kadosh, holy, only for things that we consider religiously holy. The Torah uses the word kadosh for things that are set apart, sacred by virtue of their distinction. So it is possible to be distinct for good, distinct for bad, but it's not a judgment. It's about separation. There are behaviors that are in, there are behaviors that are out. There are things that are okay, things that are not. But fundamentally, they are all part of Kedusha, which is a life understanding, a concept, a meaningfulness in which everything has its place. Some things are in and some are out, but nothing is beyond balance. In order to balance a scale, you need two sides. So there can be things that are kadosh good and kadosh bad. Shabbat, we make kiddush. Why do we make kiddush? Kiddush is we sanctify the day of Shabbat. It's different. It's special, but it's only different and special if we make it that way. A woman who is a prostitute is known as kadesha, someone who is distinct, segregated, unique. For what purpose? Within marriage, you say, Harei at mikudeshetli, you are sanctified to me. In that case, what you're doing is you're choosing to make sacred your marriage. So just listen to what the Torah is doing here. It's flattening out the curve of religion in which there are things that are sacred and everything else is either vulgar or banal or secular, so to speak. It doesn't do that. What it does is it says everything can be sacred. It's how you use it. The same woman doing the same thing, but not for the purpose of employment or money. Suddenly, that could be sacred holy or sacred not holy, depending on the transactional nature. But the act itself, the behavior itself, that's not unholy. That's not unsacred. Sacred means segregation for a specific purpose. That's it. How we do, what we do with it makes it either mundane, sacred, holy, unholy. But the concept of separation is fundamental to Jewish life. It's havdalah. It's the separation between light and dark, between holy and profane, between important and unimportant, between right and wrong. That's what Judaism is about. It's about dividing between good and not good, okay and not okay. And then, of course, what we do is we spend our lives in the gray trying to figure out how we blend the zigzag of our lives in which we dip in and out of the okay and the not okay and try to find the kav hayashar, the straight path. It's a fascinating idea. The whole idea of Kadesha is so mind-blowing that the Torah uses the word zonah, but it also uses the word Kadesha. And then the laws of money. Fascinating, the kind of compassion you have to have when you are someone who lends money. You have to have such consideration for the person that you're lending. The Talmud teaches that if you lend somebody money, you should change your route to work or Beit Knesset or wherever you're going so you don't walk by their house, so you don't make them uncomfortable. You should avoid seeing them in places where they might feel that they owe you something. It's a power. It's a power you have over somebody. We'll come back to that in a moment because it continues about when you make a vow, in verse 22, when you make a vow, you make a pledge, do not be late in paying your pledge. You make a commitment to charity, you pay it. You make a pledge to an individual, you pay it. If you are late, you commit a sin. But listen to what Moses tells them. By the way, if they call you from UJA and you make a pledge, you got to fulfill it quickly. But if they call you from UJA and you don't make a pledge, there's no sin in not making a pledge. Certainly, if you can afford it, you should. But the sin is not in not committing. The sin is in committing and not paying. Which means if you can't keep a promise, don't make it. So here's this beautiful little anecdote about a rabbi who comes to a synagogue, and he's Orthodox, and he watches as the Torah is being taken out, the cantor's walking around, everybody is touching the Torah, everyone's touching the Torah. Beautiful, they touch, they kiss, touch, kiss. The rabbi says to the conservative rabbi, I don't understand. In my shul, we go up to the Torah, we kiss it right on the Torah cover. We kiss it right on the lips, like right, mwah. We don't do that with the hand. The rabbi says, listen, in my shul, we give charity with our lips, and we touch the Torah with our hands. In your shul, they give charity with their hands, and they kiss the Torah with their lips. What he's saying, of course, is it's easy to say, oh yeah, put me in for big Schwitzer Geld. I'll give you more than you can imagine. But then, nothing with the hand. Little personal anecdote. There's a guy in Toronto, it doesn't matter, passed away, that when I was in the bicycle business, we became friendly. I knew him from the Danforth. Anyhow, he wanted to help me. He wanted to be my partner. So he wrote me some checks, 70, 80, I don't know, $100,000. He wanted to buy in. And they were post-dated, which, okay, fine. Anyhow, the day comes, I go to the bank, they say, sorry, we're having trouble cashing this, it doesn't exist. I go to the actual bank that it was drawn on. The bank says, there's no account here. There never was an account here. It's just a fake check. So I go back to the guy and I say, what's up? There's no money. He says, Yossi, it doesn't matter whether there's money or not. I wanted you to know how much I want to invest in you. So he didn't give me any money, but he wrote me a check for what he thought I would understand. He loved me that much, he would have given me that money if he had it. That's what it's like when you make a pledge and you don't put out your hand to deliver the money. So if you're going to kiss the Torah with your mouth and give charity with your hand, good for you. But if you're going to kiss the Torah with your hand and give charity with your mouth, that's what the Torah is saying. That's a sin. Whatever comes out of your mouth, you have to keep your promise. Here's a great little anecdote. Does anybody remember I Love Lucy? And there's the scene in I Love Lucy where they work in the chocolate factory. And in the chocolate factory, you're allowed to eat chocolate. And she gets stuck on the production line. It's going too fast. She ends up stuffing it in her dress and everywhere. It's a disaster. If you have never seen it, just go online and type I Love Lucy chocolate factory or whatever. But the story there is that you're allowed to eat chocolate if you're working in a chocolate factory. And everybody knows that after 2-3 days of eating chocolate in a chocolate factory, the smell gets into you, and suddenly you never want to eat that chocolate again. It's a good investment for the company to say, whatever you want, but you're not allowed to take any home. Because you can't take stuff. Maybe they'll give you seconds, but you cannot take food. You can eat food. And that is exactly the same story we have here. If you invite someone to your vineyard to harvest your grapes, They can eat as much as they want while they're working. They can't take it home because that's what they're doing. They're harvesting your property. But while they're there, eating is permitted. And by the way, the Torah extends that also to the animal. If you bring an ox into a threshing floor and it's on a stone and it's going around and milling grain and grains fall off the edge, the animal's allowed to eat them. You can't sweep it up and put a muzzle on the animal. It's unfair. It's cruel to make it smell and see and look at the grain and then never be able to eat it. The Torah, Moses has this strange, deep awareness of human behavior to other human beings, how not to let us become cruel or ignorant or ignore the finer possibilities of human interaction. There's a passage about divorcing one's wife, taking them back. There's a whole lot to explore about the dynamics of marriage and release from marriage, and then regret within relationships. It's a whole other conversation about what really happens when people get divorced and what their inner lives become and who they become, and do they really change? Is there really more regret than people will allow? Is there so much anger because people secretly are afraid they're wrong? I don't know. It's a very, very complex process. I've been divorced, and it does raise a huge amount of unique concepts that need exploring. And the text of the Torah starts to open it up with a strange story. A man and a woman are married. He divorces her. She gets married. He wants her back. You can't have her back. Once you divorce her, you can't have her back. Some will say, well, that was a way, because technically, if you want to swap wives, you both divorce your wives, halachically. You do what you want, and then when it's over, you remarry each other. It's perfect. You use halacha to circumvent, the essence of the law, which was really about rupture, and here you're using it for fun. So there's that concept, but also there's a lot about regret, and there's a lot about things that happen with exes that maybe wouldn't happen otherwise, but people do things because there's a connection that is hard to break, harder than people acknowledge. And maybe that's why there's often so much anger and rhetoric, and how unusual it is to have a good divorce. Here's this great, great idea. Chapter 24, verse 5. What happens if there's a draft? Everybody has to go to the army. Everybody. Mandatory. Wait. But what about people who are just starting new lives? So the Torah, Moshe tells us, if you get newly married, you don't go out to war. Elsewhere in the text, we learn that if you got newly married, if you built a new home, you still don't go out to war. And now, getting back to the idea of how to treat someone you lend money to, and those fundamental little bits and pieces of how to care for human beings in an exceptional way. And then I'm about to tell you a blockbuster story that still sickens me to this day. If you give someone a loan and they say to you, I don't have a lot of collateral, you say, well, what do you do? He says, I grind wheat for a living. Okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to give me the upper stone from your mill. The lower stone's too heavy. You're going to give me the upper stone. And when you pay back the debt, I'll give it back to you. Because now I know that you need me. The Torah says you're not allowed to do that because you are taking away ochel nefesh. You're taking away the ability to eat on the most simple level. You're taking away their capacity to produce food, where even though that's how they make a living, you're also demeaning and diminishing their ability to feed themselves, which is unforgivable. Which means, yes, you can take collateral, but only collateral that is not critical to their life. So, for example, if they're living in a place where water is no good, you can't take their water filter as collateral. If someone kidnaps another person, kidnapping is punishable by death because you're stealing someone's soul. Just like we were reminded to remember Amalek, we were reminded to remember Miriam and her being stricken with Sarat because the text links it to the fact that she spoke diabolically or lashon hara, gossip about her brother. It's a reminder to speak kindly about one another. And finally, this story that I told you I was going to tell you. Let me just read the text first, and then I'll finish up with that little anecdote. In verse 18, when you make any kind of loan to your neighbor, do not go into his house to take something as security. You can't go into the house. You must stand outside, and the man who has debt to you shall bring the security outside to you. So you don't shame him in front of his family. He goes in, he says, here's my most precious possession, a silver cup from my mother. It's in a little bag. Here you go. Don't make a big deal of it. Don't walk in and take it off a shelf. If the man is poor, listen to this. If the man is poor, you may not go to sleep holding his security. You cannot sleep in your own home while what he gave you is with you. Return it to him at sundown, so he will sleep in his garment and bless you. You will then have charitable merit before your God your Lord. You understand that the text is suggesting that the man that has taken a loan is so poor that the only collateral they have is their sleeping blanket. And you, as the wealthier party, the one who has loaned them money, wants collateral, but they have nothing to give you but their blanket. So obviously, you're at risk if you give it back to them at sundown because maybe he'll keep it. The text says you are not allowed to keep his blanket that he sleeps in at night because you'll hurt them. You have to give it back, even though you're at risk for your loan. But you understand how the genius of Moses and the Torah is that it reduces it to such a simple level. You might be dealing with someone who is barely wealthier than their neighbor. Maybe just has a little bit more. Maybe has 2 blankets instead of 1. He lends him $1, but that dollar means something to this person because he's not rich. He's just $1 more than this guy. But this guy has to give him his blanket as collateral. He cannot keep it at night because he's sleeping in the cold and you're hurting him. That is the way Moses describes the concept. But if you want to know how that plays out in real life, let me tell you a story. It still sickens me to this day. I had a friend who lost his mother under very tragic circumstances. And the family tried to keep it all together, and things were good. But there was some disconnect in that family. It wasn't an easy story, let's say. And our friend needed some money, needed a short-term loan, needed something. I don't know what the circumstance was. And the one thing that was most precious to my friend was his beautiful watch that was given to him by his late mother. And it was inscribed on the back of the watch, "To my dear son, mom," whatever it was. I don't remember exactly. He took his watch and he gave it to Mr. X, who said, "This watch is worth $25,000. It's a Rolex. I will hold on to it. I will lend you money." Okay, fair enough. Collateral, there's nothing wrong with collateral. It's not a question of whether I trust you or not. It's not a question of whether you're going to pay it back. You have something that is not liquid cash. I have cash. I'm trading you asset for cash. Fair enough. No interest, yes interest, I don't know. Shouldn't have been. But then all of our friends and everybody got together because we were going to my friend's wedding. And as we get on the bus, Mr. X, one of our friend group, gets on the bus, and he lifts up his arm and he says, "Yossi, look what I'm wearing." I said, "I don't know, what is that?" He goes, "His watch." I go, his watch. He takes it off. He shows me the engraving. To my beloved son, Mom, puts it back on and says, I'm wearing it to the wedding. So when I'm dancing and I'm holding his hand, he looks down, sees the watch, and remembers the wedding gifts are mine. You heard that? That is what Moses is preaching against. The power that one human being can use against another human being. Even when they have the power and both parties agree to exchange that power, you still cannot be cruel about power. Power does not give you the right to diminish another human being. It only gives you the right to demand of another human being. Is this enough politics for one day? Have I not spoken enough politics that you could take what I'm saying not as double entendre, not as subversive messaging, but as strict, straight out moral teachings, and now you can apply it any way you wish. Any way you wish. You can apply it to whatever issue you want to see it. Think about the idea of sanctity. One's sanctity is another's profanity. Think about one slave is another's servant. One servant is another's free person. Think about all the things we talk about. Not defiling your own space. Power should not be inhumane. There you go. Lots of politics. But that's how religion and politics don't intermingle, because religion speaks of the values that guide us. And politics speaks of the way and the individuals that implement them. That's why they shouldn't talk together. They should listen to each other, but not together. Shabbat Shalom.